It was early Sunday morning. The sun had just started to shine through the kitchen window. Matt poured a cup of coffee while Emily flipped pancakes on the stove. Their small dog, Roscoe, lay near the door, his tail thumping gently on the floor every time Emily moved. The house smelled like butter and maple syrup, and everything felt peaceful. Matt sat down at the table, stretching a little before taking his first sip of coffee. "We really need to fix that squeaky step outside," he said with a smile. Emily laughed softly and nodded. She had heard that same comment every weekend for the past 2 months. They weren't in a rush. Sundays were their day to relax. No work, no errands, just quiet time. Emily placed a plate of pancakes on the table and joined Matt. They talked about small things, what to watch later, maybe taking Roscoe for a walk in the park, whether or not it would rain that afternoon. But then, something strange happened. Outside, the sound of tires skidding broke the silence. It wasn't loud at first, but loud enough to catch Matt's attention. He stood up and looked out the window. A black van had stopped in front of their house. Behind it, a few more dark vehicles pulled up quickly. Men in dark uniforms began stepping out. Matt felt his stomach twist. "Stay here," he said quietly. Before she could answer, a loud bang shook the front door. Roscoe jumped up, barking wildly. Matt backed away from the door. The bang came again, louder this time, followed by shouting. It was hard to make out the words, but they were forceful, full of authority. Someone yelled, "Open the door now." Emily grabbed Roscoe and tried to calm him down. Matt reached for his phone, but before he could do anything else, the door exploded open. Smoke and light filled the room. It happened so fast, Matt couldn't think. Everything became a blur. Figures in black rushed inside, their faces hidden behind helmets and dark glasses. They pointed strange-looking weapons in all directions. Matt froze. He raised his hand slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. Emily screamed, holding Roscoe tightly. The officers shouted. Matt's heart raced as he dropped to the floor, his palms pressed against the cold wood. The officers didn't seem to care about the confusion in his eyes or the fear in Emily's voice. They just shouted more orders, and the noise of their heavy boots filled the room. Everything felt like a blur, too fast, too loud, too overwhelming. Emily was on the ground beside him, holding Roscoe tightly in her arms. The dog was shaking, his tail tucked between his legs. Matt wanted to reach out to her, but the men had surrounded them. Every direction felt like danger. He had no idea who these people were or why they were there. They had never seen any of them before. None of this made sense. "Keep your hands where we can see them," one of the officers yelled at Matt, his voice sharp and filled with authority. The man's helmet glinted in the light from the windows, making it impossible to read his face. Everything about the officer seemed cold, distant, like a robot following orders. Another officer approached Emily, who was still kneeling on the floor with Roscoe. She had tears in her eyes, and her hand shook as she tried to comfort the dog. "What is this? What's going on?" she asked, her voice cracking. She tried to stand up, but before she could, the officer grabbed her by the arm and shoved her back to the ground. "Stay down," he barked. Matt felt his breath catch in his throat. He wanted to scream at them, to demand answers, but something inside him told him to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help. If anything, it would make things worse. His mind raced, thinking about any possible explanation. Was this some kind of mistake? Who were these people, and why had they broken into their home? "Please, just tell us what's happening," Matt said, his voice trembling but firm. No one answered him. The officers were too busy moving around, checking corners, looking under furniture. It was as if they were searching for something. But Matt couldn't understand what. They didn't seem to care about him or Emily, only their mission. Matt's eyes flicked toward the door, where he could see the shadows of more officers moving outside. The front of the house was filled with chaos. More vehicles had arrived, blocking the driveway. It was like a full operation, and Matt couldn't understand how it had all come to this. He glanced at Emily, who was still sitting on the floor, trembling. Roscoe was still shaking in her arms. "They're not telling us anything," she whispered to him. "Do you know what's going on?" Matt shook his head. "No idea," he replied quietly, trying to stay calm for her. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he didn't want Emily to see how scared he truly was. Time seemed to slow down as the officers continued to search, their movements mechanical, as if they had no connection to the people they were treating this way. Matt felt a wave of frustration and fear wash over him, but he kept his voice steady. He had to figure out what was happening before it was too late. As the officers continued to move around, Matt's frustration grew. The noise of boots thumping on the floor and commands being shouted only made everything worse. They were everywhere, moving quickly, almost like they had done this 1,000 times before. But none of it made sense. Why were they in his home? Why were they treating him and Emily like criminals? Matt had never been in trouble with the law. Neither had Emily. They were just ordinary people, living their ordinary lives. Yet here they were, in the middle of a nightmare, with no explanation. His mind raced with questions, but all he could do was watch and wait, feeling more helpless by the second. One of the officers had moved to the back of the house, checking the bedrooms. Another was in the kitchen, looking under the sink. No one seemed to care about him or Emily. They were too focused on their search, as if they were on a mission, like they had already decided what they were looking for. "What are you looking for?" Matt asked, his voice growing stronger despite the fear in his heart. The officer who had been searching the kitchen didn't answer. Matt tried again, louder this time. "What do you want from us?" The officer paused for a moment, glancing at him. He didn't say anything at first, just gave him a cold stare through the visor of his helmet. But then he finally spoke. "We're searching for a suspect. You're not the target, but we need to check everything." Matt's mind spun. A suspect? But they had the wrong house. There was no criminal here, no dangerous person hiding in their home. Just them, a couple of quiet people trying to enjoy their Sunday morning. He wanted to argue, to tell them they had the wrong address, but he didn't know what else to say. The officers didn't seem interested in explanations. They were too focused on their task. "We need to check everything," the officer repeated, almost as if he were reading from a script. Emily, still on the floor, looked up at Matt with wide eyes. She seemed just as lost and confused as he felt. "How can this be happening?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. Matt wanted to answer, but the words didn't come. He glanced around, hoping someone would stop and explain, but no one did. Instead, the officers continued their search, moving with cold efficiency, as if their mission was more important than any of the lives in that house. Time seemed to stretch out endlessly. Minutes felt like hours. Matt could feel his body tense with every movement the officers made. He was still kneeling on the floor, unable to do anything but watch. He looked at Emily, her face pale with fear. She had tried to stay calm, but the situation was too overwhelming. Matt wished he could protect her from this, but he didn't know how. All he knew was that they needed answers, and they needed them fast. After a long, tense silence, one of the officers came back into the living room. He didn't say anything, just walked past Matt and Emily, his eyes scanning the room. For a moment, it seemed like nothing was going to change, but then he stopped. "Wrong house," he muttered under his breath, barely loud enough for Matt to hear. Matt's heart skipped a beat. Wrong house. Was this all just a mistake? Matt's head spun when the officer muttered "wrong house." It was a small, simple phrase, but it felt like the entire world had just shifted. Wrong house. All of this, all the shouting and the fear, had been because of a mistake. Matt blinked, trying to understand what had just happened. The officer who had spoken looked around, his face hidden behind the black mask. He seemed unsure, glancing back at the others. For a brief moment, everything paused. The room was still. The tension in the air hung heavy, like the calm before a storm. Matt looked at Emily. She was staring at the officer, confused, her hands still trembling. Roscoe, who had been quiet for a while, let out a low whine. Matt wanted to say something, anything, but his mind was racing too fast to find the right words. Another officer came into the living room, this one holding a clipboard. He walked straight to the first officer who had spoken and said something in a low voice. Matt couldn't hear what they were saying, but he didn't need to. He could feel it. A change. The tension in the room was thick, and it was clear that the officers had realized they had made a huge mistake. The officer with the clipboard turned to Matt. "Sir," he said, his voice colder than before. "We're sorry for the confusion. We're conducting a search based on a tip. We were given the wrong address." He paused for a second, clearly uncomfortable. "We'll need to leave now." Matt couldn't believe what he was hearing. All of this had happened because of a mistake. His hands still shook as he pushed himself up from the floor, his knees sore from being on the ground for so long. Emily stayed on the floor, still looking stunned, trying to understand what was going on. "You just barged in here, scared us half to death, and now you're telling us it's a mistake." Matt's voice was shaky, but there was no hiding the anger inside him. The officer who had spoken before didn't respond right away. Instead, he exchanged a glance with his partner, who was still scanning the room. The silence stretched on, making the already tense atmosphere feel even heavier. Matt could see the frustration in the officer's eyes. It was clear they had messed up. But that didn't change what had just happened. None of this made it okay. "We'll leave," the officer finally said, almost apologetically, though it didn't feel sincere. "But we need to check the address again, make sure this doesn't happen again." Matt nodded, but it didn't make him feel any better. The damage had already been done. His house was turned upside down, and Emily was still sitting on the floor, shaken by the whole experience. As the officers began to move toward the door, Matt looked around the room. Things were out of place now. The sense of safety they once had in their home had been shattered in a matter of minutes. It would take a long time before things felt normal again. Roscoe was still on edge, his ears pressed flat against his head. Matt felt a rush of anger, but he kept it inside. There was nothing he could do now, but he vowed that somehow he would get answers. This couldn't just end with an apology and a wrong house. There was more to it than that. The officers began to leave, their footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. They moved quickly, not speaking to Matt or Emily again. As the last officer reached the door, Matt stood up. His mind was still racing. He wanted answers, and he wasn't going to let this go. He had to know what had happened. Why had they been targeted? Why had everything been turned upside down without warning? Just as the last officer reached for the door, Matt found himself speaking. It wasn't a shout, or even a demand. It was calm, controlled, but filled with the anger and confusion he felt. 5 words came out, and they surprised even him. "Check the address. You're wrong." The officer froze. His hand was on the door, but he didn't move. Matt didn't know why he said it. Maybe it was the frustration, or maybe it was the way they had barged into his life without a second thought. Whatever it was, the words left his mouth without hesitation. The officer slowly turned around, his helmet reflecting the light from the hallway. His eyes, hidden behind the visor, gave nothing away. For a long moment, the room was still. No one spoke. Matt stood there, his heart pounding, waiting for some sort of response. Then, something unexpected happened. The officer who had been leading the group stepped back into the room. His partner, who had been at the door, followed him. They exchanged a quick look before the officer in charge took a step toward Matt. His posture had changed. No longer confident, but uncertain. "What do you mean?" the officer asked, his voice lower now, almost hesitant. Matt didn't hesitate. "You have the wrong house. Check the address again. You've made a mistake." The officer paused, glancing at his team. There was a brief moment of silence, and Matt could see the uncertainty growing on their faces. The leader of the group took a few steps back, reaching for his radio. He spoke into it quietly, but the words were clear. "Double-check the address. Something's not right." The room seemed to hold its breath. Matt didn't know if they would listen, if they would even care, but he had said what he needed to. He wasn't going to let them leave without confirming that they were wrong. A few long minutes passed. The officer who had been speaking into the radio was nodding now, his face slowly growing pale. The words that followed didn't quite sink in at first. "Wrong address," he muttered to himself. "This is the wrong house." Matt's heart skipped a beat. Wrong house. That was it. The entire reason for this nightmare had been because of a simple mistake. The officers were wrong. The whole team had stormed into his home for nothing. The leader of the officers looked at Matt, then at Emily, still sitting on the floor. "I'm sorry for this," he said, but his apology felt empty. "We'll leave now." Matt felt a rush of relief, mixed with anger. He nodded, but didn't speak. The officers quickly exited the house, and the door closed behind them with a final thud. For a moment, Matt stood in the silence, trying to process what had just happened. They had been wrong. They had caused so much fear and confusion for nothing. But still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There had to be more to this. Why had they been targeted? Who had made this mistake? And why? He looked at Emily, who was still trying to shake off the shock. "This isn't over," he whispered, mostly to himself. "We need to find out why this happened." Matt couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The officers had left, but their presence still lingered in the house, heavy in the air. The furniture was in disarray, and the silence felt different now. It wasn't the peaceful silence they had before. It was an uncomfortable quiet, the kind that made you question what was coming next. Emily had stood up slowly after the officers left, still looking a little dazed. Roscoe was quiet now, his tail tucked between his legs as he sat by her feet. Matt could tell she was still processing everything that had happened. He didn't blame her. How could anyone make sense of it? But he couldn't just sit there and do nothing. "I'm going to find out who did this," Matt said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but there was a fire in his words. "We need answers." Emily looked at him, her eyes still wide with confusion. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. Matt didn't respond right away. He was already moving toward his phone, pulling up the number for the local police department. He didn't know if it would help, but he had to try. He had to know why they'd been targeted. They couldn't just let it go. It wasn't just about the scare anymore. It was about the principle of it. Someone had made a mistake, and it had nearly ruined their lives. As he waited for the call to connect, his mind kept racing. Who had tipped off the police? Who had given them the wrong address? Matt had a feeling this wasn't just an accident. Something didn't add up. The phone rang twice before someone picked up. "Police department, how can I help you?" "Hi," Matt said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I need to speak to someone about an incident that happened at my home. There was a team of officers that came by, but it was a mistake. They had the wrong address." There was a pause on the other end, and Matt could almost hear the officer typing into a computer. "Can you give me your address, sir?" the officer asked. Matt gave the address and waited. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat, the tension growing as he anticipated what might come next. After a few moments, the officer spoke again. "We don't have anything listed for your address at the moment, sir. There was no operation scheduled for your location today." That only raised more questions. No operation? No explanation. How had they ended up at his house then? "So it was just a mistake?" Matt asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Someone gave you the wrong information." "It seems so," the officer replied. "I'll report this to the department and make sure someone looks into it. But for now, I don't have more details." Matt hung up the phone, feeling no closer to an answer. It was clear the police didn't have the full story. They didn't even seem to know why the officers had come to his home. Someone out there was responsible, and Matt wasn't about to let it go. "I'm going to find out who did this," he said again, more determined now. "We'll get to the bottom of this." Emily didn't argue. She just nodded, still looking shaken but knowing Matt wouldn't stop until he had the truth. Matt stood up, pacing the living room. Whoever had caused this mess was out there, and he wasn't going to rest until he knew why they had chosen his house. The answers were out there somewhere. He just had to find them. Matt couldn't sit still. The confusion from the morning still hung in the air like a fog that wouldn't lift. He couldn't believe the police had come to his house by mistake. It just didn't make sense. Someone had given them the wrong information, but who? And why? There had to be a reason they were targeted. A mistake like that couldn't happen by chance. After the phone call, Matt felt even more determined to find the truth. He wasn't going to let it go, not after everything that had happened. He grabbed his jacket and looked at Emily. She was sitting on the couch, her arms wrapped around herself, as if she were trying to hold herself together. "I'm going to check a few things," Matt said, his voice firm. "I'll be back soon." Emily nodded, though she still looked worried. "Be careful," she said, her voice soft. Matt didn't have time to explain everything, not yet. He needed to move fast. If someone had made a mistake and sent the police to his home, that meant someone else was involved. He needed to find out who and why they had used his address. His first stop was the local news website. He scrolled through the headlines, searching for anything that might explain the strange visit. There was nothing about any major police operations in the area. No reports of a suspect on the loose. nothing that connected his home to any kind of criminal activity. He felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. If the police weren't involved in any operation, then what was the real reason they had come? Was it possible someone was trying to frame him or Emily? The thought made his heart race. The more he thought about it, the more questions piled up in his mind. Next, Matt decided to visit the neighborhood. Maybe someone had seen something or heard something. There were always people around, neighbors walking their dogs, kids riding bikes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He grabbed his keys and walked out the door. As he stepped outside, he took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. It was a quiet morning, the kind where everything seemed normal. The sun was out, and the birds were singing, but it felt wrong. His world had been turned upside down, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Matt walked down the street, stopping at a few houses. Most of the neighbors hadn't seen anything unusual, but one older man, Mr. Daniels, had noticed something strange. "I saw a black van pull up near your driveway earlier," he said, his voice low. "It wasn't there long, but it caught my eye. Didn't think much of it at the time." Matt's mind raced. A black van. That didn't seem like a coincidence. Could it have been the same people who tipped off the police? Was this all connected? "Did you see anyone in the van?" Matt asked, his voice steady but filled with urgency. Mr. Daniels shook his head. "No, I didn't get a good look at the people inside, but I remember it being parked just before the police showed up." Matt's heart sank. This was starting to feel more like a setup. Someone had been watching his house, and now the pieces were starting to fall into place. "Thanks, Mr. Daniels," Matt said, nodding before he turned and walked back toward his house. He had a feeling that he was getting closer to the truth. But there were still too many questions. Who had been in that van? And why had they targeted his home? Matt returned home, his mind still spinning. The mention of the black van had added another piece to the puzzle, but it only raised more questions. Who was behind this? Why had they been watching his house? And most importantly, what were they hoping to achieve? He walked through the front door, determined to figure this out. Emily was still on the couch, her eyes a little more focused now, but the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. She knew Matt had been out asking questions, but what had he learned? What had he discovered? "Did you find anything?" Emily asked, looking up as Matt entered the room. "Yeah," Matt replied, pacing across the room. "There was a black van parked near the driveway earlier today. Mr. Daniels saw it. It didn't stay long, but it was there right before the police showed up." Emily's brow furrowed. "A van. What does that mean?" "I'm not sure yet," Matt said, his voice tight with frustration. "But it feels like we're being watched, like someone is trying to send a message or something." "But who?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with worry. "Why would anyone target us?" Matt didn't have an answer for her. He could feel the pressure building inside him, the need to figure this out. He had already done everything he could think of, checking the news, asking the neighbors, but it wasn't enough. Something was missing. Then, as he stood in the living room, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from an unknown number. Matt's heart skipped a beat. It was the kind of message that made you stop breathing for a second. "I know what you're looking for. Stop asking questions, or you'll regret it." Matt stared at the message, his fingers gripping the phone so tight his knuckles turned white. Who was this? And what did they want from him? The warning felt cold and threatening, but it also confirmed something he had suspected. Someone was behind all of this, and they didn't want him digging deeper. "Who's that?" Emily asked, noticing the change in his expression. "It's a message," Matt replied, his voice barely a whisper. "They're warning me to stop asking questions." Emily looked frightened, but there was a fire in her eyes now, too. "We can't let them scare us. We need to know what's going on." Matt nodded. He knew she was right. Whoever this was, whoever had been watching them, couldn't just get away with it. He wasn't going to back down, no matter what. This was bigger than just a simple mistake. Someone had targeted them for a reason. He took a deep breath and looked at Emily. "We're not stopping until we find out the truth," he said, his voice filled with resolve. "This isn't over." As the weight of the situation settled over him, Matt realized one thing. The search for answers wasn't just about clearing their name. It was about finding out who had put them in this position and why. And no matter how dangerous it got, He wasn't going to rest until he had the answers.